Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Joy and I have been making an effort to walk for about 30 minutes every day. Since I'm so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm walking, I've managed to work out my route in a way that I do not have to make any left turns while I'm out and about. By the way, and this is a word of caution for those who may be easily offended, this is not a safe space. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois. Our guest tonight is Dr. Donald Williams, and this is broadcast number 63. The topic is questions in evidence. Ron Hensel is our senior researcher and co-host for the Unknown Webcast, and I'm going to turn it over to Ron to talk briefly about our sponsors.
Well, greetings from sunny Florida, where global warming is so bad we haven't had a hurricane in over 10 years, I don't think. Our sponsors for tonight include the Heresy Conservation Board, ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond, and the Designer Jesus Collection, coming to a fashion show at a church near you, the Designer Jesus Collection. So we got to get
okay, and we have the Designer Jesus Collection. We're going to have fun with that as we get on.
One more thing, and that is, please, let's put them back on here. Please, to ensure continued access to this program, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. Okay, we'll have to change that.
Feel led.
Feel led. Feel led. Nothing more than feel led.
Boy, every time I see your dolphins, I think of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe as these dolphins are singing so long and thanks for the fish. And we have tonight Dr. Donald Williams putting up with our shenanigans. Greetings and salutations.
It's good to be here.
And it is good to have you. And once we're done, you will know you have been had. Why don't you tell us, remind us where you teach and some of the books that you've written?
I'm the R.A. Forrest Scholar at Toccoa Falls College in the hills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. That's a pretty impressive title, which is often taken to mean that I'm out in the woods. But it's actually F-O-R-R-E-S-T, so it can't really mean that. R.A. Forrest was our founder. And so I have the privilege of being the medieval and Renaissance guy in the English department. I also teach our apologetics course, and I get to do a little theology once in a while. I've written 10 books, most recently Deeper Magic, the theology behind the writings of C.S. Lewis. It's Baltimore Square Halo Books, 2016. So you can Google that or go to Amazon and order a copy. It's I take a look at Lewis's theology from a conservative evangelical point of view, trying to ask the question, what are its strengths and weaknesses as a guide to biblical truth? It has a lot of strengths, has a few weaknesses. And since Lewis is the greatest apologist of the 20th century and one of the most influential Christian thinkers, we definitely need a nuanced and constructive, critical assessment of his theology, which I have tried to provide in that book.
Okay. And before we come back to this, we want to hear from Ron on our weekly Facepalm Award.
Yes, the Golden Facepalm Award. This is a prestigious and highly coveted award that we just every week we get all kinds of possible candidates for this. Well, this week the Golden Facepalm Award from the Festival de Cannes Leftel is a prestigious weekly award recognizing accomplishments of distinction in the fine arts of slanting the facts, spinning the story, and other assorted tomfoolery in connection with Christianity or religion in general. This week's biggest candidate turned out to be our winner. It came from an article titled "Hillary Wants to Preach" in the Atlantic Monthly. Now, you think that alone would qualify for the Golden Face Palm Award?
You mean she hasn't been?
Well, apparently this is more the kind of preaching you would associate with, well, notice the stained glass backdrop in the picture there. The kind you would associate with church. Religion, it says, is playing a big role in Clinton's post-election tour. What does she have to gain from sharing her faith now? The article goes on and talks about a book she's writing, and finally it gets around to the subject matter of the article. And you know, when you're trying to ascertain whether what the religious take home of this story is, you might go to what would you say, guys? Maybe somebody at a Christian institution of higher education, right? And
it would be nice. Yeah,
that would be nice. And if you
find one.
And maybe you would go down to their maybe theology department or religion department. Well, they went to Calvin College. You got to give them credit for that. But they chose an associate professor of history, gender studies, and urban studies to ask questions about Hillary's faith. The one particular question was, why do people question whether Hillary's a Christian? That was a question. Well, her answer was, when I would hear Hillary speak, knowing that she was a Methodist, I just heard so many resonances about education, about women's rights, about the importance of community, she said. Because of that, it was just baffling to me that so many other Americans not only didn't know she was a Methodist, but didn't accept she was a Christian. Well, notice her criteria for being a Christian: education, women's rights, and the importance of community. You know, Don, I need to catch up on what Christianity is all about, the two Dons that we have today. Have I been left behind? Uh-oh, that could be a problem. So this week's win, yeah.
It could be a problem.
Yeah.
We probably have been left behind. In fact, my pastor this past Sunday was, and I forget the title of the book, but he's kind of talking about how many evangelicals there are in the U.S. Percentage-wise, and he said one of the problems that we have is we tend to overblow the figures, thinking there are more of us than there are, and it seems it's between 7% and 9%. So it's not as big of those who actually are theologically evangelicals. With that, it would be a pretty low number, actually.
Well, I just thought that this week's winner of the coveted Golden Face Palm Award from the Candle Laughter Festival should go to Dr. Kristen Kobes-Demez of Calvin College for confusing education, women's rights, and the importance of community with the tenets of Christianity. Round of applause for Dr. Kristen Kobes-Demez. Yes, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So we got that out of the way.
Yes, we did get that out of the way. It was almost painful this week. Dr. Donald has an interesting article on the Five Pilgrims blog site, which kind of starts off with this statement. Christianity, I would argue, is true. If this were so, you would expect to see evidence of that truth staring you in the face everywhere you turn. So why do so many people seem to miss it? Part of the secret is learning to ask the right questions. I like that statement. And then you have a series of questions that you kind of mull over or throw out there or think about. It was interesting because you were just talking about C.S. Lewis a little bit and kind of his apologetic and asking questions. And he was good at asking questions. What sort of questions did you delve into in the article, and why those particular set of questions?
Well, the first one that came to me was, if human beings are not radically fallen and totally depraved, and if the biblical account of the fall is not the explanation for why we are the way we are now, if that's not the case, why do all the ink pens in the bank have chains on them? And it just sort of got me started on a whole list of questions that, if Christianity is not true, have no answer that makes any sense at all. On the other hand, if the biblical faith is indeed the truth about the universe, they all make perfectly good sense.
Well, what makes this even worse is the question, why is it that half of the chained pens in the bank don't even write? I think that's a problem too. We need to account for.
Yeah, there are many of these profound questions, and they range from the sublime to the silly. Why is anything here? Why is there not nothing? Why is there something? And why is the something so complex, and yet with all of its diversity and complexity, able to hold together as a workable system that has reliable laws? Where did they come from? If the universe just happened by chance, sprang out of nothing for no reason, then why is water H2O in America and H2O in Europe, H2O today and H2O 100 years from now, H2O on Earth and H2O on a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri? Why, if randomness is actually the source of everything, is everything not random? So life makes no sense without God, and makes tremendous sense if he's there. Socrates got credit for establishing the Socratic method, teaching by asking questions,
which is why
because he was the first one to become famous for doing it. But actually, Jesus, we really should call it the Dominical method, because Jesus was the absolute master. If you read through the Gospels, almost every time Jesus is asked a question, he answers it with a question.
Well, that's a very kind of Jewish way of discussion and debate, isn't it?
Yeah. He either answers a question with a question, or he says, well, let me tell you a story. And then at the end of the story, he'll ask a question. Let me tell you, who's my neighbor? Well, let me tell you a story. There was this guy, and he got mugged. And then the priest and the Pharisee came along, and then the Samaritan. Well, who do you think was his neighbor? Always ends with a question. So I'm thinking, hey, it works on Jeopardy. We're focused on answers, and rightly so, but maybe we ought to pay more attention to coming up with good questions, because if we don't do that, nobody's going to be interested in listening to the answers.
Well, right. And if you ask the question, the right kind of question in the right way, it kind of changes the whole dynamic of the discussion to get you thinking in a whole different direction.
Right.
I was some years ago, I was asked to debate a professor on a junior college campus on creation versus evolution, and I had never debated anybody in an official capacity. I mean, I kind of do it as a matter of course every day, but I thought that'd be fun, and so I agreed. Well, then the professor asked the group that was sponsoring the event if I was a young Earth creationist or an old Earth creationist, and so they contacted me because they didn't really know, and I said, well, I really tend toward a young Earth position, but that isn't really what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for an intelligent designer rather than accident, cause and effect. So the professor said, well, I wouldn't be caught dead in a room with the young Earth creationists, and so he declined. Well, they had me out anyway, and so I gave a presentation comparing both possible views, at the end of which one of the students came up to me and said, well, the way you tell it, it sounds like creation is true. And I, well, okay, well, duh. So they were really quite irritated with that, and they asked the professor to come back and give a presentation himself. And so I decided to show up. I thought it would be fun. And he gave us whole presentation, at the end of which I thought, I have a good question. I have a question maybe you can help me with. let's just suppose, just for the sake of discussion, let's just suppose that in the beginning was nothing, and that for reasons we don't know, nothing exploded into everything. Let's just suppose that happened, and in that explosion, matter and gas and all of the elements just sort of happened to pop into existence as a result of an explosion from nothing for no reason. And in that mass of the explosion, some things came together that are stars, let's say, and others are planets, kind of like the Earth might be. And on that planet, let's suppose a primordial soup just happened to pop into existence. Let's just suppose that happened. And in that environment, 21 amino acids just sort of popped into existence and clung together and sparked life into a single cell. Now is where my question begins. Maybe you can help me with this. We'll assume everything else. How do we go from single cell reproduction to male-female reproduction? Single cell is arguably the easiest. You don't have to meet anybody. You don't have to date, take them to a movie or anything like that. You just divide and multiply. It's pretty simple. So how do we go incremental step by incremental step from that to male-female reproduction, which is very complicated? In fact, as I think about it, what you would have to have, because you can't just get to it in one fell swoop, really, and none of the parts really work for anything else in between. So what you would have to have is, correct me if I'm wrong, like maybe a female pop into existence, fully formed and functioning at some point in time. But you're not really there, because you have to have a male pop into existence, fully formed and functioning at a point in time. But then you're still not there, because they would have to pop into existence at about the same time in history, otherwise it doesn't really work. And you're still not there. You have to be in about the same geographic location, it seems to me, because, having one in Alaska, one in New Zealand probably is not going to be helpful. And so how do we get there incrementally? Or do we have to have a series of miracles instead? And he looked at me and he said, I have no idea. Now, that sparked a lot of discussion with the students, because they hadn't thought about that either.
And but it wasn't a problem to him. He didn't need to have the idea to believe what he believed.
He did not. He said, I assume somebody has the answers.
Yeah, that's very common. I mean, when you back a lot of people into a corner in just about any topic, there is a logical fallacy, informal logical fallacy known as the appeal to authority. All I need to do is show you that I've got more PhDs on my side than you have on yours, or maybe just quote one of them, and that settles the whole issue. That way I don't have to know. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to know the facts. I don't have to weigh the facts.
Well, one really interesting question is, why do people believe what they believe? And the answer is rarely what they would tell you or what they may even think it is. The evolutionists will tell you that, well, the evidence points to common origin, all of the fossil record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But why is that evidence pointing to that conclusion? It's because you actually just prefer a world in which there is no God to whom you are accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's usually something is driving the intellectual processes that often people aren't even aware of. Because the evidence for atheism is just strongly non-existent. I don't know how many times I've had an atheist tell me, there's just no evidence for Christianity. And I'm like, well, look, you can tell me that you don't think the evidence for Christianity is compelling. You can tell me that you think the counter evidence is more compelling, and we can discuss that. But when you tell me there's no evidence for Christianity, you're just telling me that you're not willing to have an honest discussion.
Right.
You're telling me that you're operating from a place of willful ignorance. And so, yeah, how do we break through that?
Well, it's very difficult when you have, for instance, the head of the head of the religion department at the University of Exeter in England, Francesca Stavrakopoulou, had a Greek father, British mother, is basically saying what you just said. She's going on BBC television saying there is no evidence for Christianity. There is no evidence for the existence of Moses, for the existence of the historical Exodus. There's just no evidence.
Yeah.
No evidence. The text itself is not evidence. Any text outside the Bible that we find might be evidence, just not this one.
So how did 500 people in Jerusalem around 30-ish AD come to the belief that Jesus had risen from the dead? How did that happen?
Yeah, especially in one of the letters that all authorities agree Paul actually wrote. I mean,
the great thing about just asking the question that way is it puts the burden on the skeptic. The skeptic always wants to believe that the burden of proof is on us. And they operate from that basis, and we get intimidated and we let them get away with it. When actually, if you frame your questions right, you can turn the tables. How did these people come to believe this? What's your explanation for that? Because you can't deny that at some point in the very early years of the first century, because Paul was writing about it by the 50s, you can't deny these people got convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead, so convinced that they were, many of them, willing to be killed for it. How did that happen? So what's your explanation? Mass hallucination? 500 people had the same hallucination?
Right.
Oh, right.
This is not possible.
What's your explanation? You know, the swoon theory? Well, let's take that apart. You know, you know anything about the physiology of crucifixion? You know anything about first century tomb construction? You know anything about any of this stuff? And so this guy whose ankles have had a spike driven through them, whose wrists have had the same treatment, he's going to stand up on those ankles and take those risks and place them against a very, very heavy stone with no handholds from the inside and push it and roll it back and walk out.
And not just back,
well, I guarantee
but
you,
uphill. It had to have his
if he did that, he would have scared the willies out of the guard. But you're asking me to believe something that's at least as miraculous as the actual resurrection story, and something that has much less explanatory power. So, yeah, the question is the way to get there.
But before
ask the question and put the burden on them to come up with a better explanation.
But before they can even ask the right question, they have to have some information. Everything you just asked is based on your knowledge of ancient history, of ancient culture, ancient practices. The average person doesn't have even an iota of that information.
No, that's why asking the question is our job.
Yeah.
We're the ones who thought this through and studied it. And so we've had the opportunity to come up with what the right questions are. And then if the person is actually willing to try to answer the question, then the question will drive him into the data in a constructive way so that he's going to learn the things that he needs to know in order to realize that no, the evidence isn't on the atheist side. In fact, the evidence for the resurrection of Christ, for example, is something you really have to deal with. And so, yeah, I was kind of tongue-in-cheek in that article, but I think it's a very serious thing that developing our skill of writing, of asking Socratic questions, is something that would really, really help us.
One of the things that I liked that you had posited or questioned was speaking of college campuses, why do students there talk about what they're going to do when they get into the real world?
Where do they think they are now?
They are now. Is this a fake world they're in? I mean, what is that?
Yeah, well, and I tell them, look, a campus bus will kill you just as dead as a city bus if you step off the curb in front of it, which is my evidence for the fact that you're already in the real world, and therefore you better start dealing with it.
Right.
Yeah. College students are, they raise a lot of questions, not by asking them in class, that would require preparation and actual thought, but just by existing, is it really that hard to write a complete sentence?
Are you suggesting that standards have gone down in recent years, or, well, maybe they never were there to begin with?
No, I'm not suggesting it. I would state it categorically. When I was in the 8th grade in the Fulton County schools in the Atlanta area, public schools in the 8th grade, a comma splice or a fragment or a run-on sentence was an automatic F. If you had one of those 3 errors in your paper, didn't matter what else was there, didn't matter how good the rest of it was, one of those 3 errors, the paper's an F. Now, for some reason, we quit making those errors that year. Now, if I tried to use that standard with college that was 8th grade, not even a high school freshman. That's a sub-freshman, we called them back then. If I tried to use that standard on my students that are coming out of high school today in freshman comp, I'd flunk out half the freshman class. The college would go belly up, and I'd be out of a job.
Well, I remember that as well. In fact, it was every subject. It wasn't just English. It could be math.
Right.
It could be a paper you're writing for gym, of all things.
Yeah, so I don't know what they're doing in high school these days.
And now they call it.
It's not that the standards have gone down. It's we've stopped having any.
Well, they've come up with this great novelty in K through 12, especially middle school, high school education. It's called teaching English across the curriculum. Mm-hmm. A novel idea that every teacher should examine a paper. I didn't even have to be told when I started teaching social studies and Bible back in 2003. Nobody had to tell me about teaching English across the curriculum. When my students handed in papers where instead of the word because, they wrote C-U-Z. I circled every instance of or B/C or basically the texting had already taken over in 2004. Yeah. The texting conventions. Yeah. I turned the papers back immediately and say, you've got to rewrite this. Why? Well, first of all, I don't want any green glitter ink. It has to be either black or blue. Okay. and secondly, you'd have to write out each word, and they looked at me like, what planet did you beam down from? So, but I just wouldn't accept it. To me, it was just a matter of common sense. But apparently, it's not very common.
Okay. Well, we need to hear a word from one of our sponsors.
Is it that time already?
It is that time already. We're
kind of getting off subject, so we need something to get us back on track.
I'm not sure this is going to be any help whatsoever, but
it will be fun.
We will hear from our sponsors. Listen, the situation is dire. According to the latest research, at the present rate of consumption, our supply of heresies will be completely depleted by 2050. The consequences will be disastrous. If this happens, most cults will close their doors by the end of the century, and most heretical websites will completely disappear from the internet, not to mention the fact that 75% of what passes as Christian programming will disappear from the airwaves and cable TV. The solution is simple: heresy recycling. Whether you're online, visiting a church, or out at the mall, you can do your part. Always look for the label, the Heresy Conservation Board label, ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond. It's so important, you know. You have these heresy depletion deniers.
Heresy depletion deniers.
I do battle with them daily. They keep telling me we have nothing to worry about here.
So which heresies are at the top of the endangered species list?
Well, I would say I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, I think we need an orthodoxy conservation board, but I guess that's what we are.
Well, that's kind of what apologetics does. We try to be the heresy, not the conservation board, but the orthodoxy conservation board. In fact, there's someone who at one point was fairly good standing with evangelical ministries to new religions who ended up, going in a different direction because he thought we were too concerned about, quote, boundary maintenance, end quote. And I happen to mention, Acts 20:28 seems to speak exactly to that issue.
Yeah, but shouldn't we be letting all these illegal aliens into Christianity? I mean, I don't think we should guard the borders of the faith. Do you? I mean, that's being mean. What if they're being oppressed in their native religion, and they want to come over to ours
and turn it into theirs, right?
Well,
I mean that kind of is the corollary. Is you have someone coming from a different culture into the United States, and that's fine, but they fled their country and then they want to turn the United States into their country. Well, no, that isn't what we want. We're more than glad to have you here, and you need to assimilate. Doesn't mean you have to give up your history background, but you have to assimilate to our values at the core level. Well, that's really true about the faith. We're not saying that if you become a Christian, you have to cease being Jewish, for example. But you do have to come to understanding of the essential Orthodox Christian faith in a church level. And that's what as apologists, what we're really kind of doing is saying, here's the questions that are afoot that we need to be answering.
Education, women's rights, and community, right?
Right. What else is there? That's the Holy Trinity of
Preach it, Hillary.
That's the new Trinity, I should say. When you were talking about the right questions, sometimes the people we're trying to reach deliberately ignore the question. I was watching. I didn't know that Richard Dawkins had any videos online from when he was younger, before he had gray hair and had filled out a bit. But there is a video online where he tackles the one big question that Darwin had difficulty with, which is the development of the eye. And one thing I will say, he was just as abrasive back in his 30s or 40s, or as he is today. He wasn't really softer, kinder, gentler Dawkins back then, but he was a little bit more straightforward, a little bit less full of rage. I think when I watch this video from, looks like the 80s or 70s even, I think maybe some of the rage we're seeing is because he's mad that people didn't watch all of his videos back then. But he was trying to explain the eye, and he tackled it as if the main question was, is there enough time for the eye to evolve, and how could it have evolved? So what he does is he gives examples. He had these, what are today, they'd be considered rather crude studio mock-ups of things that they were using the technology of the day to demonstrate how it could go from just a patch, a light-sensitive patch, to something a little bit more complex, something a little bit more complex. And I watched the whole thing. He totally missed the point. The point is not how much time it would take. The point is not what the different stages of eye development would look like. The point is, even if you're the simplest creature on the face of the earth and you develop a light-sensitive patch, you need two other things to make it work. You need a connection to the brain, some kind of nervous system, or let's say it's sitting right, even if it's sitting right on the brain, which would mean the brain is partially exposed, not protected by a skull, perhaps. If it's sitting right on the brain, it's still going to need specialized cells that send the information from the patch to the brain, and it's going to need specialized cells within the brain to interpret the information. In other words, you need three things to develop simultaneously. That's always been the question. You need it's system development, just like Don was talking about with it's a reproductive system.
Yeah.
That is even more diversified when you have two genders, two sexes.
Right. It's not simply a matter of time, although time is an issue, but whether the mechanism of natural selection is actually capable of doing this in any given amount of time, when
right.
you're doing everything by random mutations, and these mutations are surviving in your genetic makeup because they give you an advantage in the race for survival. But what advantage does a half-built system give you?
Right. If you developed a patch,
why would all these different features hang around in time to be able to come together and create the eye when the mechanism, as it's been explained to us, that's driving this has no reason to hang on to them?
Right. If it doesn't
until
provide
the whole
advantage.
structure is built.
Right. It's we're simply using the criteria of their system to ask these questions. And well, in this case, Dawkins went through the whole explanation, didn't even bring it up.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they're not going to do our job for us. We've got to make sure that the right questions get asked, and then very frequently, even after you ask them, they get ignored because a lot of people just want to do their spiel, and they're not really interacting with you. You know, they pause for you to talk, because if they don't, they realize the conversation will be over. But then they don't respond to anything you actually said. They just pick up their spiel where they left it off and keep going. And so the older I get, the more I keep realizing the wisdom of Jesus telling us not to cast our pearls before swine. That is, you waste a lot of time and create a lot of frustration with people who really just aren't ready to deal with what we have to offer them. And then you end up just getting in arguments, and other people who are listening, all they're really picking up is the feeling of competition and hostility, and you end up doing more harm than good. You really have to, I think, with a lot of prayer, find the people who are ready to deal with the right questions, and then help them to see what the questions are that need to be answered.
Well, and if they are asking an honest question, my friend, the late Jan Moskowitz, he was the co-founder of Jews for Jesus. He had a policy that I really liked a lot. We discussed it at some length, which is this: honest questions deserve honest answers. Dishonest questions don't deserve any answers. And so if he was engaged in a discussion with somebody and he threw out one of these sort of gotcha questions with the intent really of just trying to silence you or send you away, he wouldn't even really bother with it. He would just go on and do something else. Or he might embarrass them. He had one guy who was who was an atheist. whose mother had become a believer and had passed away. And then he challenges Jan with a question, and Jan looks at him and goes, okay, is that an honest question, or are you just trying to disparage the memory of your mother to make yourself feel better? Now that changed the whole discussion. And it ended up, it was a while, but about a year later, the guy finally contacted him back and had an actual legitimate discussion. And he ended up coming to the faith. But so, I think in teaching people how to use apologetics in the furtherance of the gospel, we have to focus on things like you're talking about here. Ask the right questions. Find out where it is that they're at, because you may not even be talking about the right subject. If you're trying to talk about, the existence of God, for example, that may not really be the issue. The issue may be they've never had friends before. I know that's true if you're talking, say, with a Jehovah's Witness. Say, okay, why are you a Jehovah's Witness? What is it that led you into this group to begin with? And if they really didn't have friends, or if it was that a Jehovah's Witness got them a job, or they were in some kind of a life crisis at the time, I may be talking about the very wrong subject with them until I figure out what it is that they're even asking.
Another mistake that a lot of Christians make when they try to use the Socratic method is they just keep peppering people with questions. And I've watched this happen, for example, on Facebook, and I can tell where the guy's trying to go with these questions, but the person he's asking them to has no idea. He just doesn't have enough background to sense what that is, and so he ends up just getting peppered, and ends up feeling like he's on the business end of a machine gun,
right?
And so we have to have discernment, and then we have to just slow down and understand, when it's time to ask a question and when it's time to suggest what the answer is. And people, you assume people can see where you're going, but being a professor disabuses you of that notion pretty quickly. If as C.S. Lewis said, if there is a sidetrack they can go off into, they will find it.
Well, I think all of us are sort of prone to that to some degree anyway. But talking about students, I remember probably 15 years ago, I had a friend who was teaching philosophy at a Christian university, and we had lunch, and he said, I'm going to share something with you, but you can't really share it with anybody else. At least you can't tell them what institution this is. Now, I think it would be more open to that today. But he said, I don't really know what to do. I teach philosophy, and I have to teach my first semester students that there is such a thing as absolute truth, which is really difficult. I never had to do that before. They came in understanding that. But with relative truth kind of permeating culture and the church, my first semester students coming from evangelical and fundamentalist churches don't even know there's such a thing as absolute truth. So I have to start at a whole different place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right. Yeah. If we think the kids that our churches and youth groups are sending us, even in conservative Christian colleges today, have the basics when they get to us, we are making a huge mistake. They may say they believe in absolute truth because that's what they've been taught they're supposed to say. Their actual thinking is that truth is completely determined by the perspective and needs of the individual. And the meaning of Scripture, meaning is not put into a text by the author to be found by the reader. or missed. Meaning is created by the reader when he reads the text. I mean, you need to talk to kids in the cafeteria when they're off guard, because they'll tell you something really different then from what they put on their hermeneutics exam to please their professor. And you realize that that both at the level of propositional truth and the level of meaning, which is prior to even getting to truth, if there's no objective meaning, then there can be no absolute truth. They really don't have those concepts, and you have to build that stuff from scratch.
The whole reader response postmodernist view, is that's a kind of a sophisticated philosophical position that you wouldn't expect kids coming into college to already have acquired.
They haven't acquired it. They don't understand it, but they have picked up the assumptions behind it uncritically and unthinkingly.
So they've taken it by osmosis. The culture sort of has ingrained it in them without explaining what it is.
So how would they articulate? How would they articulate it then? Would they say something like, well, the text means whatever you want it to mean, or something like that? What would they?
Well, what it means to me is, my situation.
Okay.
Well, but wait a minute. Is that what the text actually means? Well, the idea that there's some other meaning than what it means to me is just a new concept, and that it can't. The idea that the text can mean two completely different things to two different people just isn't a problem. They don't understand why that's an issue, why that's a problem.
When I started teaching Bible to middle schoolers, we had a text that was from a Christian publishing company, and it was actually, since we were I was at this Christian school, they thought our kids should be a little bit advanced. So these texts were actually designed for freshmen and sophomore high school students, and yet I was using them with 7th and 8th graders, or actually 6th and 7th graders. And one of the texts defined exegesis as the art of interpretation and hermeneutics as application. And I thought, this just completely turns things on its head. And then I found out where they got that from. It was from the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. So if you think about this, if hermeneutics is application, then application is what it means to me. Then we've just redefined hermeneutics as the science of what it means to me.
Yeah.
And that was in one of the standard books on hermeneutics that everybody's recommended now for over a generation.
Yeah.
By Fee and Stewart. So that's a problem.
Yeah, this is why the Heresy Conservation Board is going to have to do some serious market research in order to find its audience.
we've got to worry about something. It might as well be that,
Yeah.
So
I would hate to run out of heresy. What would we do if we had no more heresy to do battle with?
Oh, somebody would recreate them.
Yeah, it's learning by osmosis. I kind of have been enamored of that idea for a long time now, because people come to the idea that truth is relative, usually not as a philosophical understanding. It is just a practice that they have acquired by observation and that sort of thing. And the same thing with then reader meaning from the text. You imbue the text with meaning rather than getting the meaning from the text. But sadly, we see that come from the pulpit very often. I have 2 talks I just had to listen to from a church that I have loved for years. One of my favorite churches. I send a lot of people there, and 2 talks that name a text that they're working from, Uh, and they even might read some passages from it. And then they go on to talk about whatever subject they're going to talk about, which has nothing whatever to do with the text.
Mm-hmm.
It might make them feel good about what they're saying, and it gives it the air of credibility, but it has nothing to do with the context itself of the text.
One of the most important things we can do is to model good, sound methods of Bible study in our preaching. I want people not just to get the truth out of the text, but to see why that truth is in the text and why the text is teaching this. But man, that happens so seldom. People, in fact, get all kinds of bad habits reinforced from the pulpit. I see that a lot. A lot of the really, really foolish things that my kids think are right, I can trace right back to the sermons they've been exposed to their whole life. It's true in terms of doctrine. It's true in terms of the way they approach Scripture. It's even true in relatively trivial things like, instead of writing John 3:16, they'll write, in the Gospel of John, the 3rd chapter and the 16th verse. It's like, where did they get that? They got that from their preacher who has some excuse because he's giving people time to find the text. But when you're in writing and not speaking, it's just wasted verbiage. It's a bad habit.
Think of it this way, though. Don't they have a certain word count to meet?
Oh yeah, that's why you get phrases like "in our modern contemporary world of today in which we now live." I'm not kidding.
Oh, I believe it. Yes, and we of course don't forget what I had to deal with at the middle school level when a girl was telling me this story about something that happened at home, and she stopped to say, because she saw something through the window, and she says, because like our window is like this made of glass that you can like see through, and and I liked the way, I mean, I had to stop her at that point. She says, wait, I've got to write this down. She and the way the kids would use the word like in the sentence, I don't like her, I just kind of like her,
All right. Back to kind of our topic here. Right? Like back to our topic, Ron.
Yeah.
Why do professional athletes make more money than school teachers? Is the question.
Yeah, which is that's a fairly straightforward question because of the law of supply and demand, and because they're the very best at what they do. But then I use that to go up to the real question, which is, if we value our children so little that we institutionalize them outside the home at the very first opportunity so that we can have 2-paycheck households, if our children are that low on our system of priorities, why do we bother to pay school teachers anything at all?
All right. So you use daycare as your example of institutional.
Yeah. So now there are a lot of good Christian families that are bucking that trend and making real sacrifices to be able to homeschool their kids or send them to good classical Christian academies. But we just do things because somehow we pick up the idea that this is the way it's done, never asking the questions of why. Why is that what we are doing? And is that the way we should be doing it? So, okay. What should your priorities be in an area like that? If human parenting is rooted in the fatherhood of God, then that provides a different way of looking at it than if it's just a social convention that evolved. And
well, it raises a
we can do
number
it
of
any way
other
we want.
social conventions. Now that we're kind of on social convention and questions of the faith and culture. If we are simply products of time plus chance, in other words, evolution, then is there really such a thing as racism? Isn't it the case that if one race dominates another race, that's simply Darwinism in action? Is there such a thing as sexism? Really? Because isn't the whole idea of the stronger, more able to survive, not necessarily even stronger, but the more able to survive,
so the real question,
the less able to survive?
Yeah. So the real question is, on what basis, if you've gotten rid of the biblical worldview, on what basis do you say that those things are wrong or that they're a problem? How do you derive any kind of system of ethics from a Darwinian point of view that isn't absolutely horrible? You know, and the evolutionists are completely oblivious to how irrational they are at this point. So here's the question I would ask, is why is it a problem if mankind is a predatory species?
Good question.
Why are we the only species that evolved to be predatory, and that's a problem?
Right.
There's no answer to that question from a Darwinian standpoint. You end up with, there's just no reason why the strong shouldn't dominate the weak if they could get away with it.
Right, and it isn't really the case that the weak have developed what we call justice systems, police, courts, and so forth, to protect themselves from the better evolved, more capable of survival predators that we put in prison. Why do we do that? Why not let the predators do what they do?
Well, we do it because we don't want to be preyed upon.
I see.
But you know, and so, yeah, I mean, you're going to protect yourself however you can, but once you are in a position of having to try to give a moral justification for it, then Darwinism leaves you high and dry pretty quickly.
Yep. And talk about high and dry. This has nothing to do with what we're going to do next, but we do have a word from one of our sponsors.
Yes, and things have been evolving for them as well, we could say. Say goodbye to the days when your church's Jesus was a source of social embarrassment. Now even your church can keep pace with the latest fashion-forward trends in spirituality. Introducing the Designer Jesus collection. These amazing new Jesus styles are hitting church runways in the most exclusive Jesus fashion shows at churches near you. You won't want to miss Yoga Jesus, Hipster Jesus, Buddy Jesus, Socialist Jesus, and of course, Mormon Jesus. Please observe attendance requirements, cost of admission, and required attire when you attend. The Designer Jesus collection, London, Paris, Rome, New York, and Salt Lake City. So bring yourself up to date, get your fashions in order.
Design your very own Jesus for your faith tradition.
That's right, or your new tradition.
Or your new tradition.
The one you're trying to create. Yes.
You know, there are people out there who are not going to realize that this is satire.
I know. That is unfortunate. We one of the sites I love and we make good use of on our Facebook page is the Babylon Bee. But I learned a while back I have to start it out before I put any link in. Satire alert! ! Exclamation point.
See, I prefer the other method of just letting them figure it out for themselves. But
Yeah, except that I get it returned at some point. Someone pastes it in and goes, "Did you see the news about?" And I go, "No, no, no. This is fake. This is
Well-
actually is fake news."
well, do you remember when the secular site, The Onion, posted the story that Kim Jong-un was voted the world's sexiest man, and in Korea, they actually thought it was true in North Korea, and for a couple of days, they were like vaunting this. This is this great thing that this newspaper in America called The Onion has made our glorious leader the world's sexiest man.
Oh my!
It was embarrassing. I don't think they told their people what they found out.
I don't know. Okay, so learn to ask good questions. In any of your books, do you talk about this kind of a thing, or do they just have to rely on this little short article?
Oh, well, the books practice it.
Ah, okay. So if they're going to start with their very own first book by Dr. Donald Williams, which one would it be?
Well, if you're a Lewis fan, Deeper Magic, the theology behind the writings of C.S. Lewis, is a good place to start. If you're a homeschooling parent, trying to keep up with your kids in upper level humanities, I would say Inklings of Reality, Essays Toward a Christian Philosophy of Letters. If you're an apologist, Mere Humanity, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien on the Human Condition was published by Broadman in 2006. Or Reflections from Plato's Cave, Essays in Evangelical Philosophy. If you're interested in apologetics, those two books would be really good. But yeah, all of them. Yeah, obviously, you want to get the whole collection because.
Yes. And then give it away and buy another set, I would say. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. They make great Christmas presents for all your friends and relatives.
I had we're going to run over a couple of minutes here, but I was on a phone with a good pastor friend of mine today, Gino Geraci, who was remarking, by the way, Ron, on how much he enjoyed your article on N.T. Wright 2 weeks ago. And he posed a question about C.S. Lewis. Why is it that so many like C.S. Lewis cross-denominationally? And they all seem to claim him as their own. And N.T. Wright is kind of the same way. Now, in N.T. Wright's case, I would suggest, and I could be wrong, that he is popular across the board for his ambiguity. You can kind of read his stuff and claim that him as your own because something he says resonates with whatever it is that you believe. I don't think that it is the same with C.S. Lewis. It seems to me C.S. Lewis has a pretty good handle on orthodoxy and the essential doctrines, but we don't view him, this is my response, we don't view Lewis as a theologian, but rather a philosopher who includes some theology, whereas N.T. Wright is supposed to be a theologian, not a philosopher.
Well, I wouldn't even view Lewis as a philosopher. He, except at a very lay level, he was, professor of medieval literature. That was his day job. He was a Christian, and he was defending his faith, and there's so many aspects to him. I mean, the way he brought his Christian faith into literature, the literature that he produced. But his book Mere Christianity started out as radio talks during the Blitz in London.
Mm-hmm.
It was they needed somebody to come on the air and kind of distract people from the turmoil and the the chaos and the havoc that Hitler was raining down on them. And so he would just, it was almost like fireside chats over here, but he would come and talk about the Christian faith, which seemed like a pretty sensible thing to talk about when you might face death tomorrow morning or tomorrow night.
Yeah.
So
Lewis was just plain good to start with. Then secondly, he had a strategy of sticking to what he called mere Christianity and focusing on the truths that serious Christians of any denomination have in common. And then thirdly, I think probably more than anybody else, you have in Lewis the integration of reason and imagination working hand in hand, walking together as a team. You know, some of us have good imagination. Some of us have sharp analytical minds. Very few people have both developed to the top of their capacity the way Lewis did, and have them really working together. So in a book like Mere Christianity, you have analogies like the house and the hall and the rooms to represent Christianity and the different denominations, or like the rooms off of the hall. That's imagination. It produces those kinds of word pictures and analogies. And then you go into the fiction, and you're reading the Narnia books, and lo and behold, here's a set piece of rational apologetics. It's like Professor Kirk is using the trilemma to explain why Lucy isn't crazy or lying about having been to Narnia. And so there's the famous rational argument from Mere Christianity integrated into the fiction seamlessly. And nobody did that better than Lewis.
Okay, good.
So
that's
it helps to be
good
ingenious.
yeah.
it
helps to be
kind of helps. Yeah.
All right. Now next week, Ron, just in case you didn't know, we are going to have our friend Carl Teichgrib on again, and we're talking about from transgenderism to transhumanism.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so that's going to be a fun talk.
That should be good.
And Dr. Williams, it is good to have you on again. We'll do this again at some point in the future.
By the way, if check out the issue of Touchstone, September issue of Touchstone just came out. Mine showed up in the mail today. I've got an article in there on the Christian worldview in Tolkien.
Oh, okay.
So
cool. Touchstone. We'll have to try to track down a copy of that. All right, Ron, you want to have our sponsors walk us out of here?
Well, these are the people who just made this possible tonight. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Mormon Archives manager Polygamus. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief, Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are solely responsible for its content, although you'll never be able to prove that in a court of law.
All right. Dr. Williams, again, thank you. And Ron, we will see you all next week.
Adios.
Sounds like a plan.